Josiah and Sarah Moore were respected members of Villisca. Josiah ran a hardware store. Sarah devoted herself to family and church. They had 4 children: Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. In the 9th of June, 1912, the Moores attended their church's Children's Day program. Joining them were 2 sisters, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who were invited to sleep over afterward. By 10 p.m., the 8 returned home. Oil lamps were turned down, beds filled, and the house fell silent. Sometime after midnight, the killer struck. Cigarette butts found in the attic suggest he may have hidden there for hours, waiting. He first entered Josiah and Sarah's bedroom. Using Josiah's own axe, the killer struck them repeatedly. Josiah received the worst of it, blows so violent the blade gouged deep into the ceiling above the bed. He then moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, all murdered in their beds. Finally, the Stillinger sisters. Ina was found beneath the covers. Lena's body showed signs she may have awakened. Unlike others, she was found lying crosswise on the bed, and her nightgown was pulled up, and she was partially undressed. Early reports suggested possible signs of attempted sexual assault, though nothing was ever conclusively proven. What is certain is that Lena's body appeared to have been staged after death, positioned in a way that set her apart from the other victims. The killer lingered inside the house. He covered mirrors and windows, draped cloth over the faces of the dead, and even prepared a meal in the kitchen, a meal he never touched. A slab of raw bacon was left in a strange position. To some investigators, these details all combined suggested the murders might not have been driven by rage alone. They wondered if the crime bore the markings of a ritual, a ceremony understood only by the killer. Next day in the morning, neighbor Mary Peckham stepped outside to hang laundry. She noticed something unusual. The Moore house was silent. The animals were unsettled. Chores were left undone. She knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the front door. It was locked. Highly unusual in Villisca, where most families never bothered with locks. She called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived with his own key and went inside. In the downstairs bedroom, he found the bodies of the Stillinger sisters. He ran back outside, shaken, and told Mary something was terribly wrong. Town Marshal Hank Horton was called. He entered the house and confirmed the worst. The entire Moore family and their 2 young guests had been murdered. Doctors and investigators soon followed. But before the house could be secured, word of the killings spread through town. Dozens of townspeople crowded inside, moving through every room, touching objects, even viewing the bodies. By the time authorities cleared the house, crucial evidence had already been trampled and disturbed, a mistake that would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. With no fingerprints, no weapon other than Josiah's own axe, and a crime scene already contaminated by curious neighbors, investigators were forced to rely on suspects and theories. 3 names surfaced again and again. One was Reverend George Jacoby Kelly, a traveling minister originally from England. Kelly had arrived in Villisca shortly before the murders and attended the same Children's Day service as the Moores and Stillinger girls. Known for eccentric behavior, Kelly was described as erratic and socially awkward. He was accused of sending obscene letters, making unwanted advances toward women, and even asking to photograph young girls. On the 10th of June, the morning of the murders, Kelly left Villisca on a 5 a.m. train, placing him within the narrow time frame when the crime occurred. Later, he became obsessed with the case, writing letters to investigators and relatives of the victims, sometimes including details not released publicly. In 1917, 5 years later, Kelly was arrested and confessed under interrogation, claiming God had commanded him to kill. But he soon recanted, and his confession contained contradictions. He faced 2 trials, the first jury deadlocked, and the second acquitted him. Kelly walked free, and the evidence against him was never strong enough to secure a conviction. Many in Villisca remained convinced of his guilt. Others believed he was simply a mentally unstable man who inserted himself into the investigation, desperate for attention. Officially, his connection to the murders was never proven. Another suspect was Frank F. Jones, a wealthy Villisca businessman and state senator. Jones had once employed Josiah Moore at his store, but when Moore left to start his own hardware business, he took with him the profitable John Deere account, a financial blow and personal humiliation to Jones. Rumors also spread that Josiah had carried on an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, adding a potential motive beyond business rivalry. While Jones had the stature and connections to be above suspicion in the eyes of some, others in Villisca believed he may have arranged for the murders rather than committed them himself. That theory led investigators to William Mansfield, a man nicknamed Blackie. Mansfield was a known criminal who had allegedly worked as a hired gun. Detective James Wilkerson of the Burns Detective Agency became convinced that Mansfield had been paid by Frank Jones to kill Josiah Moore. Wilkerson claimed Mansfield matched the profile of the killer and linked him to other axe murders across the Midwest, including a family slaughter in Kansas and another in Illinois. But evidence was thin, and an alibi placed him elsewhere at the time of the Villisca murders, and no charges ever stuck. But whether or not Mansfield was involved, Villisca was not an isolated case. In the years around 1912, eerily similar crimes shook small towns along the rail lines. Monmouth, Illinois, 1911, a family murdered with an axe. Ellsworth, Kansas, 1911, another family attacked in their beds. Colorado Springs, 1911, 6 people killed in the same manner. Paola, Kansas, 1912, a family slaughtered just days before Villisca. The details overlapped in ways too precise to ignore. Entire households were slaughtered as they slept, the victims often killed with the blunt end of an axe rather than the blade. This method left massive head wounds, but reduced the chance of the axe sticking in bone. In many homes, lamps had their chimneys removed and the wicks turned low. Mirrors and reflective surfaces were covered with cloth. Victims' faces were draped, as if the murderer could not bear their gaze. In some homes, a meal was prepared and left uneaten. In others, a bloody bowl of water suggested the killer had calmly washed his hands before leaving. Doors were often locked behind him, trapping the victims inside until discovery. Detective James Wilkerson argued that William Blackie Mansfield had committed these murders while traveling the railroads, leaving death in his wake. But Mansfield was not the only suspect tied to the theory of a roving axe murderer. Some pointed to Henry Lee Moore, convicted in 1912 of murdering his own mother and grandmother with an axe. Others suggested a German immigrant named Paul Muller, linked to a suspected trail of axe killings stretching back to the 1890s. What united these theories was the belief that Villisca was not unique, but part of a larger wave of unsolved axe murders that swept across America's heartland in the early 20th century. Yet, despite the similarities, no suspect was ever definitively tied to all the crimes. Each theory ended the same way, with no proof. More than a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain one of America's darkest unsolved crimes. 8 lives ended in silence, a killer who vanished without a trace, and a house that still holds its secrets. By the late 20th century, the Moore house had fallen into disrepair. In 1994, local residents Darwin and Martha Lynn purchased the property. They restored it to its 1912 condition, no electricity, no plumbing, furnished as it was on the night of the murders. Their goal was to preserve the history of the crime and the memory of its victims. Since then, the Villisca Axe Murder House has become one of America's most famous haunted homes. Thousands of visitors tour it each year. Some come to study the crime, others come searching for signs of the paranormal. Many leave with stories they cannot explain, even today.